This is Stephen Strang, and welcome to the Strang Report. Today we're going to talk about Sir Issac Newton and a very important riddle. You know, during this time of quarantine and kind of the shutdown, it's interesting to learn that Sir Issac Newton went through a quarantine too. It was in the year 1665. It was part of the bubonic plague. Cambridge, where he taught, was shut down, and for 2 years he was quarantined. And during that time, he used his gifts of observation to outline the laws of motion, optics, and invented calculus. This was in addition, of course, to come up with what we now call the law of gravity. I mean, can you believe it that he did this during this time of quarantine? It's very interesting. And my guest today has written a novel based on some of his theological works. You know, he's known as a scientist, but really, if you look at his work, he wrote many more things about the Bible, and we're going to talk about it today. So stay tuned.
Welcome to the Strang Report with Steve Strang on the Charisma Podcast Network.
I'm very happy to have back on the Strang Report Neill Russell. I did a very interesting podcast with him just a few days ago. You can check it out on the Charisma Podcast Network. We talked about truth, especially about Genesis 1:1. But my guest, Neill Russell, is a prolific writer, and he's written this novel that I'm actually reading called Newton's Riddle, and it has to do with the book of Daniel. And I just wanted to have kind of a conversation about it. I mean, this is something we could probably talk about for hours, but podcasts tend to be short, and I mainly just wanted to start by asking Neill how you became aware of this work of Sir Issac Newton and his fascination with the book of Daniel. And most people don't really understand the book of Daniel, and especially about, you know, the prophetic end-time riddle that you talk about. And, you know, Daniel was crying how and when, you know, without a basic understanding of God's eternal perspective of time and eternity. And without that, we may never be able to solve these puzzling mysteries. So talk to me about these mysteries. Talk to me about the Archangel Gabriel and the other things that you bring out, and how you wove this into just a fascinating novel that really takes truth, like you were talking about this present darkness, and kind of fictionalizes to answer this riddle.
Let's go back in time. Let's go back in time when God called a man out of his homeland, a man that was named Abram, to leave with his wife and his family and all his herds and go to a land where God would show him. And out of faith he went. Many years later, his name was changed to Abraham, and God asked him to do something again, an unthinkable request. Take your prized possession, your son Isaac, your only son, on top of a mountain and make him a sacrifice to me. Now that's hard to believe that a man would do that, but out of obedience he went on top of the mountain, and God sent an angel to stop him, and he did. And God made this eternal covenant with him. I will bless those who bless your people, and I will curse those who curse your people. God also gave him a parcel of land. This land's right in the center of the earth. Take a look. It's called Israel. And God's promise is not one grain of sand can be given to anybody, any nation, without my permission. This belongs to your people, Abraham. And God assigned an angel and a host of angelic beings to divinely protect Israel. Israel is divinely protected by Michael, the archangel. This is in Daniel 12:1. There's also a warning in Daniel 12:1. The archangel Michael, Israel's assigned protector, will one day stand aside. He's already done that one time, and I'll show you. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will stand aside. There will be a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. And here's the story. There's a picture of Jesus. He's walking through the streets of Jerusalem with his disciples. This is days before he was crucified. In Matthew 24:1-2, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. And Jesus said, "Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Take a look at the picture. This was taken when we were in Israel back in 2011. It's the same area. Those stones that you see piled up, the broken street, this is newly excavated. This is where Titus's men threw all the stones down, cracked the street. Jewish historian Josephus estimates that 1.1 million Jews were killed by the Roman army of Titus, and that 115,880 dead were carried out of one of the gates during the month of Nisan in the year 70 AD, and that 79,000 Jews were taken as slaves. And this is called the Jewish diaspora. The Jews were scattered because of what they did. They were cursed. They killed God's Son. Warnings upon warning are in the Bible. The Jewish state of Israel came to an end in 70 AD when Romans actively drove the Jews from their home that they've lived in for over a millennia. Now, Isaac Newton said this: by studying the prophetic verses described in Daniel 9:25 through 27, Newton foresaw that one day in the future, a friendly kingdom would someday issue a command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now, centuries later, after Newton, there was a friendly kingdom, and it may have been the United States that decreed the rebirth of Israel as a nation on May 14, 1948, fulfilling a 2,500-year-old prophecy by the prophet Isaiah, "Shall a nation be born in one day?" The Jews returned on May 14, 1948, after 2,000 years of being dispersed. David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, proclaimed the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel. And take a look at the picture. He's standing there with the U.S. President Harry Truman, who recognized also the nation on the same day, the friendly nation that supports Israel. Israel's population. Before it became a nation, there were 543,000 Jews that lived in that area. Only 30% of the population back then, before it became a nation, was Jewish. 1948, that number went up to 716,000, non-Jewish population 156,000. 82% of Israel is now Jewish. Let's go in time. 2019, 6,772,000 Jews lived in Israel in 2019, 74.1% of its population. Worldwide, there's 14,700 million Jews, or 1,000 Jews. I'm one of them. Israel right now, first time in all these centuries, has more Jews living in its borders than ever before. 6,738,000, 74% of its population. The United States is second with 5,700,000. Take a look, folks. God has blessed America because we have blessed Israel. I believe we are protected by Michael and his angels also. But the moment we go against Genesis 12:3, Michael will be pulled aside. I believe that may have happened. We're going to take a look at past warnings right now. Before I continue, I want to encourage all of you listening, all of you watching, to send this video to everybody. This is God's timing. For the first time in history, it is being explained how past, present, and future events are all tied into the Genesis 12:3 blessings. Remember that the United States was the first nation to recognize Israel in 1948. The United States was the most prosperous nation in the world's ever seen. For the next 4 decades, the United States was Israel's best ally and provided a safe haven for Jewish people in which they can live without persecution that they faced in most foreign nations. Here come the curses. Curse number 1. October 30th, 1991, the United States President George H.W. Bush signed the Oslo Accords at the Madrid Peace Conference. This began the United States' pressure to divide Israel, to force Israel to trade their land for peace with the Palestinians. The United States President George W. Bush signed the Oslo Accords on that date, and within 24 hours of his signature, a freak perfect storm, they made a movie on this, produced 30-foot-high waves that damaged George Bush's private beachfront home in Kittybunkport, Maine. Curse number 2. On August 23, 1992, President Bush met in Washington, D.C. to pressure Israel to give their Genesis 12:3 land to the Palestinians. On that date, Hurricane Andrew, a Category 5 hurricane, slammed into Florida, causing $30 billion in damage while destroying 180,000 homes. It was the worst natural disaster ever to hit the United States up until that point. Curse number 3. On February 18, 1993, President Bill Clinton's administration made its first trip to Israel with the purpose to restart the peace talks with 7 Arab nations. On that date, Arab terrorists hit the World Trade Center in New York City with a 1,500-pound car bomb. Curse number 4. On January 16, 1994, President Bill Clinton met in Geneva with Syrian President Assad for the purpose of pressuring Israel into giving up the Golan Heights. The morning after the meeting, a powerful 6.6 Northridge earthquake rocked Southern California, becoming the second most destructive natural disaster ever to strike the United States, right behind Andrew. God says, when they divide my land, I will divide theirs. Curse number 5. On September 28, 1998, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright worked on the first details of an agreement with the Arab leaders meeting at the United Nations to pressure Israel into giving up 13% of Judea and Samaria. A hurricane named Georges with winds over 175 miles an hour slammed the United States Gulf Coast at the same time PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat addressed the United States declaring an independent Palestinian state by May of 1999. Georges pounded the Gulf state, causing $1 billion damage. Curse number 6, September 7, 2001. On that date, George Bush engaged Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and Secretary of Defense Colin Powell to draft a resolution to create a Palestinian state by September 23, 2001. That never happened. On the morning of September 11th, exactly at 8:46 and 36 seconds a.m., the wrath of Muslim suicide bombers and terrorist attacks came to the shores of America. 8:46 a.m., a plane crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 9:03 a.m., another plane hit the South Tower. 9:37 a.m., Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. September 11, 2001 was the worst terrorist attack in the history of America. 3,000 Americans died. Curse number 7. On August 23, 2005, the world watched as the last Jews were forcibly removed by their own countrymen from their homes in the Gaza Strip. This was due in response to tremendous pressure exerted by our president and his Secretary of State on Israel to disengage from Palestinian land. Take a look at those pictures, folks. You remember this. Katrina is one of the worst disasters ever to hit the world. 30-foot-high storm surges, damage everywhere, businesses destroyed, New Orleans underwater. On August 23, 2005, 9,000 Israeli citizens were evicted from their Gaza homes by their own government, and shortly after, 1 million Americans were evicted from their homes in Louisiana and Mississippi by Hurricane Katrina. Businesses were forcibly abandoned in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, many businesses were destroyed in Louisiana, Mississippi, and other Gulf cities. What America has done to Israel, God has done to America. Consider this, folks. 1 year after this disaster, the same number of Jews that were forcibly removed from their homes in the Gaza equaled the same number of Americans that were living in public housing because their homes were destroyed. Curse number 8. May 19, 2011. On this date, President Barack Obama called God's covenant nation, Israel, to relinquish East Jerusalem and the entire West Bank to the Palestinians and return to its pre-1967 borders. On that date, in Joplin, Missouri, a supercell tornado cut a mile-long path of devastation through the entire town, a half-mile wide, killing 231 people. Curse number 9, January 28th, 2020.
This is the very day our President Donald Trump unveiled his long-awaited Middle East peace plan, promising to give Israel more sovereignty over much of the Jordan Valley and the West Bank, but still giving the Palestinians a portion of God's covenant land. the following major events occurred. At approximately 2:10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 28, 2020, a powerful 7.7 earthquake struck between Cuba and Jamaica. Now, this type of an earthquake that hit did not produce a tsunami because it's called a transform fault. That was a warning. In fact, they felt it. I'm not sure if you felt the earthquake in Florida where you live, but that was a tremendous earthquake. On January 30th, the first case of person-to-person transmission of the coronavirus is confirmed in America between a married couple in Chicago. The same day, the World Health Organization named the corona outbreak that originated in China a public health emergency of international concern. Now that brings us to the present moment. And this is the meaning of Newton's riddle. The riddle is this. Okay, we are at the time, and again, Newton tried his best back then, but it wasn't God's timing, to find out when end time events will take place. And I truly believe we're there.
This is absolutely fascinating. I mean, you tie in the stock market crash, you tie in all this stuff, and it's just amazing. It almost reminds me in some ways of Jonathan Cahn's Harbinger, where, and more recently, the Oracle, where he is able to tie in actual dates that tie in 70 years from something, relates to something else. I mean, I don't have time to go into it. But let me ask you this. If you had the opportunity right now to talk to President Trump face to face, what would you say to him?
It's a good question. President Trump, I have a scripture here that's not often read, but I'd like to read you verbatim what I've written down. It's in Obadiah 1:15. The day is near when I, the Lord, will judge the godless nations. As you have done to Israel, so it will be done to you. All of your evil deeds will fall back on your heads. This proclamation that God made, he saw down the line that there would come a time when Israel would become a nation, and that the United States, as I believe Isaac Newton saw, would support its existence. And the only reason that Israel's on earth today, besides God's prophetic plan, was that there was a friendly nation to support its existence. But in the Bible, it says that all nations, at one time in the future, will withdraw their support from Israel. And folks, that time is very, very near.
And so your message, of course, is a warning to the president that America must not withdraw its support. And I know there are millions of Christian Zionists, as I call them, and as I call myself, who would stand firm with you on this. And, you know, I just think this is so eye-opening, and people need to get their heads around this. They need to get this in their spirit. So as we wrap up this podcast, help me and my listeners understand exactly where they can find this fascinating novel, Newton's Riddle.
Folks, you can find Newton's Riddle. If you go to the website that God had me make years ago, and on the website you will see the interviews that we did and explaining things that happened in our house that the devil tried to keep me from finishing this book. But the website's called newtonsriddle.com. And again, this is something that, this is God's timing to have this interview done at this time, because I wrote that book starting in 2005, and here we are in 2020, and I truly believe we're on the verge of seeing these events happen. So again, thank you for having me on your show. And folks, you can find out, if you would like to purchase the book, you go to newtonsriddle.com.